My name is Callie Merritt. I am 31 years old. I grew up on 14,000 acres of East Texas ranch land that my family told me, in 100 different ways, would never belong to me. For 20 years, my father used my ADHD diagnosis the way some people use a locked door, not to protect anything, just to keep someone out. He paid my brother a salary 6 times larger than mine to run a company I understood better than either of them. And when he finally moved to cut me out entirely, he did it at a steakhouse in Houston in a parking lot, on a phone call he didn't know I could hear. What he didn't know was that a dead man had already answered him. Uncle Hector had been gone 3 years by then. But he'd left something in my glove compartment. A green ledger. And instructions I hadn't opened yet. Before I go any further, if you've ever been written off by the people who are supposed to see you clearly, drop the word ledger in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I read every one. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I post every week. Now, let me take you back to Beaumont, Texas. To red dirt roads and the smell of crude oil and a family that confused silence with weakness for 30 years. The Merritt Ranch sits about 40 minutes outside Beaumont, down a county road that turns to caliche gravel about a mile before you reach the front gate. The gate itself is rusted at the hinge, has been since I was 9, and it makes a sound like something giving up every time you push it open. I loved that sound as a kid. I thought it meant I was home. The house is a white 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that sags on the east side and central air that groans every August like it resents being asked. My mother kept a vegetable garden along the south fence until she passed in 2014. After that, the garden went to grass. My father didn't replace things he considered optional. There were 3 of us. Preston was the oldest, big, easy-laughing, the kind of guy who could walk into any room in East Texas and have 3 new friends in 10 minutes. He played safety at Texas A&M on a partial scholarship and wore that fact like a name tag well into his 30s. Jade was the youngest, sharp and focused, and determined to leave the moment she was old enough to have a reason. She made it to UT Law and then to a firm in Dallas, and she only came back for Thanksgiving and funerals. And then there was me, middle child, diagnosed with ADHD at 9, which in our house was handled the way you'd handle a cracked windshield, acknowledged briefly, never fully repaired, and mostly just worked around. My father's approach to my diagnosis was efficient. He told me once, sitting in his truck outside the neurologist's office while my mother filled a prescription inside, "Callie, everybody's got something. The ones who make it just don't use it as an excuse." I was 9. I filed that sentence somewhere deep and carried it for 20 years. I wasn't stupid. I want to be clear about that because the rest of this story only makes sense if you understand that. I was restless, yes. I lost things. I talked over people when I got excited. I read contracts in a nonlinear order that frustrated every teacher I ever had. But I also noticed patterns in documents that trained professionals walked right past. I remembered conversations verbatim months after they happened. I could look at a land parcel map and understand the story the boundaries were telling before I read a single word of the deed. Nobody in my family called that a skill. They called it Callie being Callie. Thanksgiving 2016. I was 23. Dale. I call my father Dale now, a choice I made deliberately and that he has never commented on, was describing a mineral rights deal he was considering near Nacogdoches. I listened to the terms. Something felt wrong in the structure. The royalty split didn't account for a likely pipeline easement that would depress the per acre value in the second year. "Dad," I said, "what happens to the lease value if they run the pipeline through Section 4? He looked at me the way you look at a dog that has wandered into a conversation. Not unkindly, just confused about why it was there. "Preston," he said, turning. "Pass the rolls." My cousin Darla caught my eye from across the table. She gave me a small, private look that said, "I heard that. I'm sorry." I picked up my fork. The green bean casserole steamed on my plate. I ate and said nothing. That was the pattern in miniature. That was the whole story in one Thanksgiving. Uncle Hector was my father's younger brother by 7 years, and they were different the way East Texas and West Texas are different, same state, different planets. Dale built things by acquisition. Hector built things by understanding. He'd spent 40 years as a petroleum landman, which means he spent 40 years reading oil and gas leases, tracing deed chains through county courthouses, untangling the legal history of land that families had owned for generations without ever fully knowing what they owned. He was the kind of man who kept a magnifying glass in his shirt pocket and used it unselfconsciously in public. He smelled like cedar and coffee and old paper. He never married. He drove a 2003 F-150 with a cracked dashboard until the year he died. He kept every deal he ever worked recorded in a battered green ledger book with a cracked spine, columns of his tight, precise handwriting going back to 1979. I spent every summer from age 12 to 17 at his place in Midland. He'd spread county plat maps across his kitchen table and teach me how to read them, not like a document, but like a story. Who owned this land first? What did they trade to get it? What were they afraid of losing when they signed? Callie, he told me one August evening, the oscillating fan moving warm air across the kitchen, a deed from 1962 spread between us. Lawyers read contracts looking for exits. You read them looking for truth. Don't ever stop doing that. I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought he was talking about professional methodology. He wasn't. In the spring of 2021, Hector had a stroke. He was gone within the week. I drove to Midland for the service. Dale gave a short eulogy that was technically accurate and emotionally empty. Afterward, Hector's personal attorney, a quiet man named Warren Gish out of Odessa, found me in the parking lot of the funeral home and pressed a business card into my hand. He left instructions, Warren said. When you're ready. 6 weeks later, I drove to Odessa. Warren handed me a small fireproof lockbox, the kind you buy at a hardware store, black, with a combination dial. Inside, the green ledger, a USB drive and a paper sleeve, and a sealed envelope marked in Hector's handwriting. Callie, don't open until Dale makes it impossible to ignore. I drove home to Austin with the box on my passenger seat. That night I put it in my glove compartment. I told myself I'd know when the time came. For 3 years, every time I reached for my registration or my insurance card, I felt the corner of that box. I left it where it was. The stipend had been $28,000 a year since I turned 25. No title. No benefits. No equity discussions. Dale described it to extended family as keeping Callie connected to the business, which was a gracious way to describe paying someone the annual salary of a part-time retail manager to stay peripheral to a $34 million company. I supplemented it with my consulting work, small farmers mostly, who were getting pressured by corporate agricultural buyers trying to separate landowners from their mineral rights through confusing lease language. I was good at it. I charged fair rates, worked out of my truck half the time, and built a quiet reputation in the hill country and piney woods regions as someone who could be trusted to tell you what a document actually said. Preston called me in February of 2022, just to catch up, he said. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, casual as commenting on the weather, Dad's talking about formalizing the governance structure, bringing in a consultant to clean up the entity organization. What does that mean for the holdings? I asked. Just housekeeping, Preston said. Nothing dramatic. I wrote that down after we hung up. I kept a notebook. Habit. 6 months later, I learned from my cousin Darla, the same Darla who'd caught my eye at Thanksgiving in 2016, that Dale had held a meeting with Preston and 2 senior attorneys at the company's Houston law firm. Darla's husband worked in the same building. He'd seen the sign-in sheet. My name was not on the attendee list. I drove to the county courthouse in Beaumont the following week. It took me 2 days of searching. I found it. Dale had filed amended operating agreement for Merritt Family Holdings, restructuring governance authority. Preston was named sole managing member. There was no family vote. There was no conversation. There was no phone call. I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long time. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the live oak above me. I thought about the lockbox in my glove box. I didn't open it. Not yet. Then came October. Preston made VP of Operations, the title formalized, the salary increased, the announcement made over dinner at a steakhouse in Houston's Galleria district. Dale organized the dinner. 14 people. Nice place, the kind with leather menus and a sommelier who doesn't smirk. I was invited. After the yacht race, I stepped outside to get some air. The parking lot was warm, that particular Houston evening warmth that doesn't let go even in October. My father was standing 20 feet away, back to me, phone pressed to his ear. I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. Something in his posture, maybe. The way he was slightly hunched, like he was trying to make himself a smaller surface area. Before the end of Q4. Frame it as restructuring, not termination. She doesn't have an employment contract, so there's no exposure. A pause. The stipend? Yes. Just don't renew it. She'll figure it out. Another pause. No. She won't push back. She never does. He laughed. Not a mean laugh. Worse. A certain laugh. The laugh of someone who has already finished a calculation and moved on. I walked back inside. I sat down at the table. I ate my steak. I listened to Preston make a toast. I smiled at the right moments. That night, in the parking garage, I sat in my truck and opened the glove compartment. I broke the wax seal on Hector's envelope. I want to pause here for a second, because if you've ever been the person in the room that someone assumed wouldn't push back, if you've ever had someone count on your silence as their safety net, I want you to type the word enough in the comments right now. Let me know I'm not telling this alone. Because what happened when I read Hector's letter that night in that parking garage, what he had known, what he had prepared, what he had left me, I almost couldn't breathe. Keep watching. We're just getting started. The letter was 3 pages, Hector's handwriting, neat as surveyor's marks. He told me about 1979, the original Merritt oil lease, the one that became the company's anchor asset, the one Dale had built the holdings around, had 2 co-signers. Dale's father, my grandfather Roy, and Hector. Hector had contributed capital, contributed labor, and signed the original lease agreement as a co-owner. Over the years, through a series of entity reorganizations, his interests had been quietly subsumed into the corporate structure without ever being formally compensated or legally extinguished. It wasn't an accident. It was architecture. Patient, deliberate architecture. The USB drive contained recordings from 2019. Hector had recorded his own phone calls, legal in Texas, single-party consent. On those calls, Dale discussed with a friendly accountant the best method to reclassify Hector's historical contributions as loans, not equity, before Hector's health declined further. The accountant's voice on the recording sounded uncomfortable. Dale's did not. I called Warren Gish in Odessa the next morning. He'd been waiting. He already had a forensic title analyst on retainer who had spent 8 months tracing the deed chain. Hector had commissioned the work before he died. He knew you'd call, Warren said. He just didn't know when. I spent the next 3 weeks building the case. Not because Warren needed my help, he didn't, not really, but because I needed to understand every layer of it myself. I pulled county records. I cross-referenced the 1979 lease against every subsequent entity reorganization document. I found the moment where Hector's interest disappeared from the official record. It was 2003. A single filing. A restructuring document that redefined the asset contributions in language so technical and so dense that you'd have to know specifically what you were looking for to find the problem. I knew what I was looking for. The night before the mediation, I sat on the porch of my rental house in Austin. The neighborhood was quiet. A sprinkler system 2 houses down ran its cycle. The streetlight made the cedar tree in the front yard cast a long shadow across the yard. I held the green ledger in my lap, Hector's handwriting, column after column, going back 45 years. His record of every deal, every handshake, every promise made and kept or broken. I let myself feel it then. All of it. The Thanksgiving dinners. The parking lot. 22 years of being the person they handed the check to so they wouldn't have to hand her the keys. Then I closed the ledger, set it on the porch rail, went inside. I had a 9 a.m. appointment in Beaumont. I didn't need a battle cry. I just needed to show up. The mediation was held at a law office on Calder Avenue in Beaumont. 3rd floor. A conference room with vertical blinds and a long laminate table and a tray of pastries nobody touched. Warren was already there when I arrived, along with his forensic title analyst, a small, methodical woman named Dr. Patricia Hale, who had testified in over 200 Texas land cases, and who had the quiet authority of someone who has never once been wrong about a deed. Dale arrived at 9:08. He came with 2 attorneys from the Houston firm and Preston, who was listed as an interested party. Preston looked uncomfortable. He kept his eyes on the table. Dale walked in the way he always walked into rooms, slightly ahead of everyone else, hand extended, voice warm. "Warren," he said, like they were running into each other at a barbecue. "Good to see you. Let's get this sorted out." He saw me. Something crossed his face, surprise, recalibration, and then the warmth returned, adjusted. "Callie, didn't know you'd be here." "I requested the mediation," I said. "A beat. Of course." He took his seat at the far end of the table. One of his attorneys leaned over and whispered something. Dale shook his head slightly. Warren opened the session. Standard framing, purpose, ground rules, no recordings without consent. He introduced Dr. Hale. He introduced me as Hector Merritt's designated estate representative, a designation Warren had filed 6 weeks prior and which Dale's attorneys had apparently not examined closely. "We're here to discuss the disposition of Hector Merritt's estate interest in assets held by Merritt Family Holdings," Warren said. Dale's lead attorney, a man named Clifford with silver cufflinks and a practiced patience, leaned forward. Hector Merritt held no documented equity interest in the holdings. His estate was settled in probate without any claims against company assets. "That's what I'd like to address," I said. I opened my folder. I placed the first document on the table. This is the original 1979 oil lease agreement for the Merritt Tidewater property in Hardin County. You'll see it carries 2 co-signer lines, Roy Merritt and Hector James Merritt. Clifford looked at it. His expression didn't change, but his hand stilled on his pen. That lease was superseded by the 1987 entity reorganization, which redefined asset contributions but did not formally extinguish the co-signer's equity interest, Dr. Hale said. Her voice was flat and factual as a survey marker. Under Texas property law, that interest does not expire through administrative reassignment. It requires either formal buyout, documented consent, or court adjudication. None of those occurred. I placed the second document on the table, the 2003 filing, the one that had quietly buried Hector's name in a reclassification footnote. "This is the 2003 restructuring document," I said. "Page 11, footnote 4. Dale's eyes moved to the page. For the first time since he'd walked in, the warmth left his face entirely. I put my phone on the table. "Press play." Dale's voice came through the speaker, clear and unhurried, in a conversation from November 2019. "We need to reclassify his contributions as loans before anything happens with his health. If it's debt instead of equity, there's no inheritance claim on the asset." The accountant's voice. "Dale, I'm not sure I'm comfortable. You've been comfortable with my retainer for 12 years. Figure it out." I stopped the recording. Preston's chair moved. He was looking at the wall now. His jaw was tight. Dale said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. Still. His face had the quality of someone who has just heard a sound they can't identify and is deciding whether to pretend they didn't hear it. "The recording establishes intent," Warren said quietly. Dr. Hale's analysis establishes the legal encumbrance. Hector's estate holds a 22% unresolved interest in the 1979 lease, which remains the primary productive asset of the holdings. "We're prepared to file a formal claim in district court. Or," Warren opened his own folder, "we can resolve this today." Clifford and Dale's second attorney leaned together. A whispered conversation that lasted 90 seconds. Dale did not join it. He was still looking at the phone on the table. Then he looked at me. I held his gaze and said nothing. My hands were folded. The green ledger was in my bag. I didn't need to take it out. He already knew what was in it. "What are your terms?" Clifford finally said. I opened my folder to the last page, slid it across the table. "These are Hector's terms," I said. "He wrote them in 2020. I want to ask you something before I tell you what happened next. If you were sitting at that table, If you had spent 30 years being told you couldn't follow along, and you had just watched your father's attorneys go quiet, what would you have done? Option A, take the settlement and walk away clean. Option B, push for more. Make it public. Option C, something else entirely. Tell me in the comments. Because what I chose and what it cost me and what it gave me, I think you might not expect it. The settlement took 6 weeks to finalize. Hector's estate received a structured payment representing his 22% historical interest in the 1979 lease, a number that, once Dr. Hale's valuation was applied across the asset's productive life, came to just over $4.1 million. The holdings were required to carry that as a documented liability, which triggered a mandatory restructuring review under the terms of their existing bank covenants. Preston's title as managing member was suspended pending the restructuring. Not stripped, suspended. There's a difference, and I want to be honest about it. Preston hadn't known the full scope of what Dale had done in 2003. He'd benefited from it, yes, but he hadn't orchestrated it. Dale retained his title, but the amended operating agreement, the one he'd filed without a family conversation, was rolled back by the mediator's consent order. He no longer held unilateral governance authority. The Houston law firm resigned from the account within 2 weeks. Their formal letter cited conflicts arising from the mediation outcome. The informal reason, which Warren heard from a colleague, was that Clifford had been embarrassed professionally and didn't intend to spend more time in a room where he could be surprised like that again. 2 of Dale's longtime business partners in the Beaumont area, men he'd hunted with, men whose names appeared on the same charity golf tournament programs year after year, quietly declined his invitations over the following months. No confrontation. No statement. Just suddenly busy. Dale's publicist, I didn't even know he had a publicist until this, reached out to Warren suggesting a mutual narrative around the settlement. Warren forwarded the email to me. I read it twice. Then I told Warren to decline. The morning after the settlement was signed, I got a call from a woman named Renata Ochoa. She ran a small ranching operation near Lufkin and had been in a mineral rights dispute with a corporate buyer for 3 years. Someone had given her my number. I heard you know how to read a lease, she said. I do, I said. Can I hire you? That was the first client of what became Merritt Land Advisory. I didn't name it that right away. That came later. But Renata was first. Preston called in December. We met at a diner halfway between Austin and Beaumont, a place off I-10 with a gravel lot and vinyl booths and coffee that arrived before you asked for it. He was already there when I pulled in. He looked like someone who had not been sleeping well. We talked for 2 hours. Most of it I'll keep private, because it was genuinely his to say, and not mine to repeat. But there was one moment I'll tell you about. He said, I didn't know about the 2003 filing. I want you to know that. I believe you, I said. And I did. But I knew things weren't right. I knew you weren't being treated the same way. And I didn't say anything because it was easier not to. I let that sit there between us. The coffee steamed. A trucker in the next booth was reading a newspaper, old-fashioned, actual paper. I know, I finally said. That's the part that mattered most. Preston nodded. He looked out the window. What do you need from me? Nothing right now, I said. But if I ever call and ask, I need to know you'll answer. He said he would. I think he meant it. We're not close, not the way siblings on television are close. But we're not enemies, either. That's more than I expected. Dale called in January. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. I called him back the next morning. The conversation was short and formal, 7 minutes. He did not apologize. He said he hoped I was well. He said he thought Hector would have been satisfied with the outcome. I didn't agree with that, but I didn't argue either. What I said at the end was, I'm willing to have a relationship with you, Dale, but it has to be an honest one. I won't pretend the last 20 years didn't happen. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. One word. I don't know what it meant, but it was more than I'd gotten before. 1 year later. My office is a converted bungalow in East Austin, 3 blocks from a talk area I eat at twice a week. There are 2 desks, mine and my associate. A young woman named Becca who graduated from Texas A&M with a land management degree and who reads deed chains the way other people read novels, fast and hungry. We have 6 active clients. 4 of them were referred by Renata Ochoa. I testified before the Texas House Natural Resources Subcommittee in March. 12 minutes on mineral rights notification requirements for rural landowners. Afterward, a representative from Beaumont, a woman I'd never met, shook my hand and said she'd grown up on a ranch and understood exactly what I described. I drove back to Beaumont in April. Not to the family ranch. Not yet. Not for that. I drove to the county courthouse. I walked through the same parking lot where I'd sat in my truck 3 years ago listening to a mockingbird. I went upstairs and pulled the original 1979 lease one more time, just to look at it. Hector's signature was still there, tight and precise. I took a photo of it on my phone. I drove back to Austin. That night, I put the green ledger on my desk. It stays there now, permanently. I don't open it every day. It's not a manual, it's more like a compass. When a case gets complicated, when a client's situation looks tangled past untangling, I sometimes just put my hand on the cover. It helps me think. My father called on my birthday in September. I was in the middle of a lease review, and I let it ring. I called him back 3 days later. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He asked about the business. I told him a little. He said he was proud of me. Just that, flat and unadorned, like he was reading it off a card. I said thank you. I meant it the way you mean something that comes too late to change anything but still manages to matter a little. Jade came to visit in November. We ordered takeout and talked until 2 in the morning. She said she'd had no idea how bad it had been. I believed her. She'd been in Dallas. She'd been building her own life. We're learning each other the way you learn someone when you start late, carefully, without assumptions. That's the most I can say about where we are. Careful, without assumptions. It's not nothing. Here's what I know now that I didn't know when I was 9 years old sitting in a truck outside a neurologist's office in Beaumont. The thing my family called a flaw, the restlessness, the non-linear thinking, the inability to sit still inside other people's frameworks, was the exact thing that let me read a 45-year-old deed chain and find the one footnote that changed everything. My mind was never broken. It was just running a different kind of search. Hector knew that. He spent years teaching me to trust it. And when he was gone, he left me the tools to prove it, not to my father, not to Preston, not to anyone else. Just to myself. That's the inheritance. That's the whole thing. If you've ever been told that the way your mind works is a problem to be managed, I want you to sit with this. The people who told you that were measuring you against a standard that was never built for you. That's not your failure. That's their limitation. Tell me your story in the comments. One line. Who underestimated you? And what did you do with it? Subscribe if you want to hear what comes next. Share this with someone who needs it. There's a link in the description to more stories like this one. My name is Callie Merritt. I used to be the daughter they handed a stipend to keep quiet. Now I'm the woman who read the deed they forgot existed. Not the same person. Not even close.